The Boeing 777's engines hummed their familiar lullaby 37,000 feet above the Pacific. Most passengers dozed fitfully, their dreams interrupted by turbulence that seemed to rattle the aircraft's very soul. In Seat 8A, wrapped in a military-issued poncho liner she'd carried through 3 combat deployments, Major Callista Ghost Reeves slept with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to find rest between artillery barrages. She didn't stir when the first flight attendant rushed past, worry creasing her features. Ghost remained motionless as hushed conversations erupted near the galley, voices tight with barely contained panic. Even when the captain's measured breathing could be heard over the intercom, she maintained the deep sleep of the perpetually exhausted. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking." The words finally penetrated Ghost's consciousness, dragging her from dreams of desert skis and the metallic taste of adrenaline. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Are there any military pilots aboard this aircraft?" Ghost's eyes snapped open, muscle memory from countless emergency scrambles flooding her system with alertness. Around her, passengers shifted nervously, whispering among themselves. A businessman in 8B glanced at her rumpled civilian clothes and dismissed her immediately. Behind them, a teenager asked his father what was happening. The captain's voice returned, more urgent now. "I repeat, any military pilots with combat experience, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately." Ghost unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movement fluid despite hours of cramped sleep. At 5'6", with prematurely silver-streaked auburn hair and unremarkable features, she looked like any other tired traveler. The flight attendant approaching from first class barely glanced at her. "Excuse me," Ghost said quietly, her voice carrying the particular calm that comes from speaking over rotor wash and jet engines. "I'm Major Callista Reeves, United States Air Force." The flight attendant, Jessica, according to her name tag, looked skeptical. "Ma'am, I need to ask that you return to your seat. We're looking for military pilots." "I am a military pilot." Ghost reached into her carry-on, producing a worn leather wallet. Inside, her military ID caught the cabin's artificial light. "A-10 Thunderbolt, 3 combat deployments. What's the situation?" Jessica's demeanor shifted instantly as she registered the ID's authenticity. "Ma'am, please follow me. The captain needs to speak with you immediately." As Ghost moved toward the cockpit, she caught fragments of panicked radio chatter bleeding through the aircraft's speakers. Something about instrument failure, emergency vectors, and weather conditions deteriorating rapidly. The pieces of a familiar puzzle began forming in her mind. The kind of puzzle she'd solved countless times in environments where the stakes were measured in lives rather than lawsuits. What she didn't yet know was that Flight 447 had just lost both primary and backup navigation systems over one of the most treacherous stretches of ocean on Earth, with a storm system approaching that would test every skill she'd learned in the crucible of combat. Captain Morrison stood as she entered the cockpit, his weathered face pale beneath his captain's hat. "Thank God. We need all the help we can get." His hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the instrument panel, where warning lights blinked like malevolent Christmas decorations. "We've lost GPS, inertial navigation, and our backup compass system is giving us conflicting readings. Weather radar shows a Category 4 storm system moving directly into our flight path." First Officer Bradley Chen looked up from a manual he'd been frantically consulting. "We're essentially flying blind, Major. No navigation, limited weather data, and fuel calculations that depend on knowing exactly where we are." Ghost studied the instrument panel with the methodical precision of someone trained to diagnose catastrophic failures under pressure. The situation was worse than they were letting on. She could see it in the micro-expressions that survived even the most professional military bearing. "How long ago did the navigation systems fail?" 18 minutes, Morrison replied. Started with the GPS dropping signal, then cascaded through all our primary systems. We're maintaining heading based on our last known position, but you don't know if that heading is taking you towards safety or directly into the storm," Ghost finished. She'd seen this before, different aircraft, different ocean, but the same fundamental problem, technology failing precisely when you needed it most. Chen's radio crackled to life. "Flight 447, this is Oakland Center. We've lost your transponder signal. Please confirm your position and intentions." The irony wasn't lost on Ghost. For the past 3 years, since her medical discharge after an IED explosion left her with chronic pain and tremors in her left hand, she'd been told repeatedly that her flying days were over. Too damaged, too unreliable, too much of a risk. The Air Force had thanked her for her service and shuffled her toward a desk job processing other people's retirement paperwork. Now, suspended between heaven and hell at 37,000 feet, surrounded by 243 souls who had no idea their lives hung in the balance, she was exactly where she belonged. This was the moment she'd been unconsciously preparing for through every night of insomnia, every phantom pain that reminded her of missions she could no longer fly. "Captain," she said quietly, "I need you to tell me everything. Fuel status, passenger manifest, nearest suitable airports, and your backup communication systems. Then I need you to trust me when I tell you we're going to get these people home." Morrison's relief was palpable, but Ghost caught something else in his expression: doubt. She'd seen it countless times before, from crew chiefs who questioned her pre-flight procedures to squadron commanders who assumed her small stature meant she couldn't handle a $30 million aircraft in combat conditions. The radio erupted with urgent voices from air traffic control, each transmission more desperate than the last. Oakland Center had lost contact with 3 aircraft in the same general area, suggesting some kind of widespread system failure or atmospheric interference. Flight 447 wasn't just lost. They were lost in the middle of what was rapidly becoming an aviation emergency, spanning thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. Ghost pressed her palms against the instrument panel and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, a ritual she developed before every combat mission. When she opened them, the doubt in Morrison's face had been replaced by something approaching hope. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of pilots who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. "All right, gentlemen," Ghost said, rolling up her sleeves to reveal faded scars from her last deployment. "Let's go to work." The next 4 hours would test everything she'd learned about flying, leadership, and the thin line between disaster and survival. What she didn't know was that her actions aboard Flight 447 would ripple through military aviation circles, leading to questions about how the Air Force evaluated damaged pilots and why they'd let one of their most gifted aviators slip through their fingers. Chen keyed his radio. "Oakland Center, Flight 447. We have a military pilot aboard assisting with navigation. Request priority handling and direct vectors to nearest suitable airfield." The response crackled back immediately. "Flight 447, understand you have military assistance. Be advised, Honolulu International is reporting severe weather, San Francisco is below minimums, and Los Angeles is experiencing similar navigation system failures. We're working to establish your position, but we need you to maintain current heading until further notice." Ghost studied the weather radar display, its swirling colors painting a picture of atmospheric violence that stretched across their entire flight path. She'd flown through worse: sandstorms over Iraq that turned day into night, monsoons over Afghanistan that could flip an aircraft like a coin, but never with 243 civilians depending on decisions she made from a jump seat. "Captain, I need to understand your crew's experience level. Have either of you flown in actual instrument conditions without navigation aids?" Morrison and Chen exchanged glances. "We've both done some military flying," Morrison admitted. "I was Navy, flew P-3 Orions for 8 years before transitioning to commercial. Bradley here was Air Force but Transport Command. Ghost nodded. Transport pilots were skilled, but their training focused on getting from point A to point B efficiently, not necessarily on survival when all the technology failed. Combat pilots, on the other hand, learned to expect their equipment to malfunction at the worst possible moment. "Here's what we're going to do," she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We're going to navigate using techniques that predate GPS by about 50 years. Dead reckoning, celestial navigation if we can get a break in the clouds, and something the Air Force taught me called educated guessing with extreme prejudice." Chen almost smiled at that, almost. The aircraft shuddered as they encountered the outer edges of the storm system, and Ghost felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried her through 73 combat missions. This was different. No surface-to-air missiles, no enemy fighters, just physics and weather, and the unforgiving mathematics of fuel consumption versus distance remaining. But in many ways, it was exactly the same. Lives hung in the balance, technology had failed, and success would depend entirely on experience, instinct, and the kind of stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had earned her the call sign Ghost in the first place. She'd gotten that name not for her ability to disappear, but for her tendency to appear exactly where the enemy least expected her, at moments when conventional wisdom said she should have been somewhere else entirely. Today, 37,000 feet above the Pacific with 243 souls depending on her judgment, seemed like exactly that kind of moment. The radio crackled again. Flight 447, Oakland Center. We're showing multiple aircraft experiencing similar navigation failures in your vicinity. Current weather reports indicate the storm system has intensified to Category 5. Recommend immediate deviation to alternate course. Ghost leaned forward and keyed the mic herself. "Oakland Center, this is Major Reeves aboard Flight 447. Request you treat this as a military emergency and provide all available assistance. We are proceeding with emergency navigation protocols and will advise our intentions shortly." There was a pause then. "Flight 447, understand military pilot aboard. Be advised we have limited radar contact due to weather interference. You are effectively on your own for navigation until you can establish positive position." Morrison's knuckles went white on the control yoke. Chen began frantically calculating fuel burn rates against distance estimates that might be completely wrong. And Ghost, sitting in a jump seat behind them, began to understand that this wasn't just about getting one aircraft safely to the ground. This was about proving that when everything else failed, technology, systems, the comfortable certainties of modern aviation, the human element still mattered. That experience, intuition, and the hard-won wisdom of combat operations could bridge the gap between disaster and survival. What she couldn't have known was that air traffic controllers across the Pacific were already calling it the Ghost Flight, an aircraft that had vanished from their screens but continued to fly, guided by a pilot whose name would soon become legend in aviation circles worldwide. As the storm closed in around them, Ghost began to smile. For the first time in 3 years, she was exactly where she belonged. The turbulence hit them like a physical blow, throwing Ghost against her restraints and sending serving trays clattering through the cabin behind them. Outside the cockpit windows, lightning illuminated towering thunderheads that rose like malevolent mountains into the stratosphere. The aircraft shuddered and bucked, fighting the storm with every rivet and weld. "Jesus Christ," Chen muttered, struggling to maintain level flight as wind shears tried to flip them like a paper airplane. "I've never seen weather this violent." Ghost had. Over the Hindu Kush, flying close air support for a special forces team that had walked into an ambush, She'd threaded an A-10 through a thunderstorm that meteorologists later said should have been impossible to survive. The key wasn't fighting the weather, it was understanding its rhythms, finding the pockets of stability that existed even in the heart of chaos. "Captain, reduce airspeed to 250 knots and descend to flight level 300, she ordered, her voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms and radio chatter. "We need to get below the worst of this turbulence." Morrison hesitated. Standard procedure was to climb above weather, not descend into it. But something in Ghost's tone, the absolute certainty that came from having made life-and-death decisions in conditions that would paralyze most people, convinced him to comply. As they descended, the ride smoothed marginally. Ghost had counted on the storm structure being typical of Pacific weather systems, violent at altitude, more manageable at lower levels where wind patterns were disrupted by surface effects. It was a gamble based on experience rather than meteorological data, but it worked. "How did you know?" Chen asked, wonderment creeping into his voice. "Afghan thunderstorms," Ghost replied simply. "Physics doesn't change just because you're over water instead of mountains." The radio crackled. Any aircraft, this is Coast Guard Cutter Steadfast. We are observing multiple aircraft in distress. Any pilot requiring assistance, please respond on this frequency." Ghost grabbed the microphone. "Coast Guard Steadfast, this is Major Reeves aboard Commercial Flight 447. We have navigation system failure and are proceeding on emergency protocols. Can you provide position reference?" The response came immediately. "Flight 447, Steadfast. We have you on radar bearing approximately 180 degrees from our position, distance unknown due to weather interference. We are located at 35 degrees, 45 minutes north, 142 degrees, 30 minutes west." For the first time in 2 hours, Ghost had a fixed reference point. She began calculating vectors in her head, the kind of three-dimensional mathematics that had been drilled into her through countless navigation exercises. The Coast Guard vessel's position put them roughly 300 miles northeast of their intended flight path, not catastrophic, but concerning given their fuel status. "Captain, what's our current fuel state?" Morrison checked his instruments. 17,000 pounds remaining. At current consumption, we have maybe 90 minutes of flight time. Ghost felt the familiar calm that descended during crisis situations. 90 minutes wasn't much, but it was enough if they made the right decisions. The key was avoiding the paralysis that came from overthinking. In combat, hesitation killed more pilots than enemy action. She studied the weather radar, looking for gaps in the storm system that might provide a corridor to clearer skies. There, a narrow band of lighter precipitation extending roughly southwest from their current position. It would take them further from their intended destination, but it might also take them out of the worst weather. "Bradley, plot a course 225 degrees magnetic," she instructed. "We're going to thread the needle through that gap in the storm front." As Chen worked his calculations, Ghost found herself remembering her last combat mission, the one that had ended her flying career. It had started similarly: equipment failures, impossible weather, and a situation that required split-second decisions based on incomplete information. The difference was that mission had ended with her A-10 scattered across an Afghan hillside and her body broken on the rocks below. But that was then. This was now. And this time she had something she hadn't had before, the knowledge that sometimes survival meant accepting help, trusting others, and admitting that even the most experienced pilot couldn't do everything alone. The aircraft banked left as Morrison followed her heading, and suddenly they were flying through a corridor of relatively calm air, surrounded on both sides by towering walls of storm clouds. Lightning flickered around them like artillery fire, but the turbulence had decreased to manageable levels. "I'll be damned," Morrison breathed. "How did you see that?" Ghost didn't answer immediately. How could she explain that combat flying had taught her to see patterns in chaos, to find order in situations that appeared hopeless? That every mission over hostile territory had been an exercise in calculated risk-taking based on incomplete information. Instead, she keyed the radio again. Oakland Center, Flight 447. We have established visual contact with storm structure and are proceeding through a weather gap on heading 225. Request vectors to nearest suitable airfield with approach capabilities below current weather minimums. The response was immediate. Flight 447, Oakland Center. Recommend diversion to Fairchild Air Force Base, Washington. They have precision approach radar and are equipped to handle emergency landings in minimum visibility conditions. Ghost felt a chill that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. Fairchild was where she'd been stationed during her first assignment as a young lieutenant, fresh out of flight training, and convinced she could conquer the world. It was also where she'd met Colonel Marcus Thunder Washington, the squadron commander who had first called her Ghost, after she'd successfully completed a night navigation exercise that had stumped pilots with twice her experience. If they diverted to Fairchild, she'd be going home in the most literal sense possible. The irony was overwhelming. The pilot the Air Force had deemed unfit for flight status was about to save 243 lives by landing at the very base where her career had begun. Fairchild AFB, Roger, she responded. Request you notify base operations that we have a former Air Force pilot aboard assisting with emergency navigation. What she didn't say was that Fairchild was also where Colonel Washington now served as Deputy Commander of Air Mobility Command, the officer who had signed off on her medical retirement paperwork 3 years earlier. The same officer who had told her that chronic pain and tremors made her unsuitable for flight operations, despite her combat record and demonstrated ability to perform under pressure. In 40 minutes, she would either prove him right or spectacularly wrong. There would be no middle ground. The storm began to break apart around them as they continued southwest, patches of clear sky appearing like islands in an ocean of clouds. For the first time since the crisis began, Ghost allowed herself to believe they might actually make it. But she'd learned in combat that the moment you started feeling confident was usually when everything went catastrophically wrong. Her hand unconsciously moved to her left wrist, where a faded scar marked the spot where shrapnel had severed tendons and ended her flying career. The tremors that ended her military service were barely noticeable now, but she knew they would return if her stress levels spiked high enough. The irony was perfect and terrible. The very condition that had grounded her might resurface at the moment when steady hands were most critical. She'd spent 3 years wondering if the Air Force Medical Board had been right about her fitness for flight operations. In the next hour, she would finally have her answer. As they flew through the eye of their own private storm, Ghost began to understand that this flight was about more than navigation and weather. It was about redemption, second chances, and the question of whether someone broken by combat could still be trusted with the lives of innocents. Behind them, stretching back through the passenger cabin, 243 people dozed, read, or stared anxiously out their windows, most unaware that their survival depended on a pilot the military had discarded like a defective component. The radio crackled. Flight 447, Fairchild Approach Control. We have you on radar, distance 180 miles southeast. Current weather is 200-foot ceiling, half-mile visibility in freezing rain. Approach minimums are 203/4. Can you accept precision approach runway 5? Ghost looked at Morrison and Chen, reading the doubt in their expressions. Landing in weather that marginal would test the skills of any pilot, and they were attempting it with failed navigation systems in an aircraft they hadn't flown together before. Fairchild Approach, Flight 447, Ghost replied. We accept precision approach runway 5. Be advised we have partial navigation failure and will require radar vectors throughout the approach. As they began their descent toward Fairchild, Ghost found herself thinking about Colonel Washington's words during her medical evaluation. "Callista, you were one of the finest combat pilots I've ever commanded. But flying in combat and flying with civilians are two different responsibilities. The stakes are different when you're carrying families instead of ordnance." In 30 minutes, she would discover whether he had been right. The approach began 20 miles from the field, with Fairchild's radar controllers providing precise vectors that would guide them through the freezing rain and low clouds to the runway. Ghost had flown hundreds of instrument approaches during her career, but never under conditions quite like these: partial equipment failure, marginal weather, and the weight of civilian lives pressing down on every decision. Flight 447, Fairchild approach. Turn left heading 45, descend and maintain 4,000 feet. You are 10 miles from the outer marker, cleared for precision approach runway 5. Morrison's hands were steady on the controls, but Ghost could see the tension in his shoulders. Chen worked frantically with backup instruments, calling out altitude and airspeed in the precise cadence of emergency procedures. Outside the cockpit windows, freezing rain created a tapestry of ice that distorted their view of the approaching ground. "Localizer alive," Chen called out as their instruments picked up the electronic signals that would guide them to the runway. "Glide slope coming in. Now, we're established on the approach." Ghost monitored their progress with the detached focus that had kept her alive through 73 combat missions. Everything was proceeding normally, but she'd learned to distrust normality. In combat, the enemy always attacked when you least expected it. In aviation emergencies, catastrophic failures clustered at the moments when you most needed your systems to function perfectly. Flight 447, Fairchild Tower. Wind 60 at 15 gusting to 25, visibility 1/2 mile in freezing rain, ceiling 200 broken. Runway condition braking action fair. You are cleared to land runway 5. The runway appeared through the murk exactly where it was supposed to be, a ribbon of lights cutting through the gray wash of weather. Morrison's landing was textbook perfect, firm but controlled, with reverse thrust and braking that brought them to a stop with room to spare. As the engine spun down and the aircraft settled onto its landing gear, Ghost felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: the quiet satisfaction of a mission successfully completed. Behind them in the passenger cabin, applause erupted as travelers realized they were safely on the ground. But even as passengers began reaching for carry-on luggage and preparing to deplane, Ghost knew this story was far from over. Air traffic control had logged their emergency. The airline would conduct a full investigation, and word would inevitably reach Air Force circles that a medically retired pilot had talked a commercial crew through one of the most challenging flights in recent memory. Within hours, her name would be circulating through Pentagon corridors and aviation safety offices around the world. The pilot the Air Force had deemed unfit for flight operations had just proven that sometimes experience and instinct mattered more than perfect health and functioning equipment. As they taxied toward the terminal, Ghost caught sight of a familiar figure standing near the base operations building. Even at a distance, Colonel Washington's ramrod posture was unmistakable. He'd come personally to witness her return to Fairchild, though whether out of professional curiosity or personal concern remained to be seen. "Major," Morrison said as they completed their post-flight checklist, "I don't know how to thank you. Without your help." Ghost unbuckled her restraints and stood, feeling the familiar ache in her left hand that reminded her daily of her limitations. "Captain, you and your crew did the flying. I just helped with the navigation." But they all knew it had been more than that. Leadership wasn't about having the best equipment or the newest training. It was about making decisions under pressure, taking responsibility for outcomes, and projecting confidence even when doubt gnawed at your certainties. As passengers filed past the cockpit, many stopped to shake Ghost's hand or offer quiet words of thanks. A businessman who had dismissed her earlier now looked at her with something approaching awe. A mother traveling with two young children pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. A child's drawing of an airplane with the words, "Thank you for bringing us home," scrawled in purple crayon. Ghost pocketed the drawing and stepped off the aircraft into the gray Washington afternoon, where Colonel Washington was waiting. "Hello, Thunder," she said quietly, using his old call sign for the first time in 3 years. "Hello, Ghost," he replied, and she caught something unexpected in his voice, pride mixed with regret. "We need to talk." Colonel Washington led Ghost through the familiar corridors of Fairchild's Base Operations Building, past walls lined with photographs of aircraft and aircrew that spanned decades of military aviation history. She recognized many of the faces, squadron mates, instructors, and commanders who had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be a military pilot. They settled into Washington's office, which overlooked the flight line where C-17 Globemasters and KC-135 Stratotankers sat ready for missions that would take them to every corner of the globe. The view stirred memories of early morning briefings, pre-flight inspections, and the particular excitement that came from preparing to take a military aircraft into harm's way. The FAA is calling it one of the most impressive examples of crew resource management and emergency navigation they've seen in years, Washington began, his voice carefully neutral. The airline wants to offer you a job, CNN wants an interview, and half the Pentagon wants to know how we let you slip through our fingers. Ghost studied her former commander's face, looking for clues about his real thoughts. Marcus Washington had been a mentor, father figure, and ultimately the man who had ended her military flying career. Their relationship was complicated by layers of professional respect, personal affection, and institutional necessity that defied easy categorization. "You did what you had to do, Thunder. The medical board was right. My condition made me unsuitable for military flight operations under normal circumstances." Washington leaned forward, his expression intense. But these weren't normal circumstances, were they? Today proved that experience and judgment can compensate for physical limitations in ways our medical evaluation processes never considered. The admission hung between them like smoke from old battles. The Air Force's medical standards were designed to ensure pilot reliability under standard operating conditions, but they couldn't account for the kind of crisis management that defined combat operations. Ghost's tremors and chronic pain made her a liability during routine flights, but in emergency situations where experience mattered more than perfect health, she remained one of the most capable pilots either of them had known. "What are you saying, Marcus?" "I'm saying we might have been wrong. Not about the medical issues, those are real and documented, but about what those issues meant for your ability to contribute to military aviation." Ghost felt a surge of emotions she'd spent 3 years suppressing. Anger at a system that had discarded her despite her proven abilities. Relief that someone finally acknowledged the possibility that medical retirement might have been premature. And underneath it all, a fragile hope that her flying career might not be over after all. "The Air Force doesn't have a mechanism for undoing medical retirements," she pointed out. "Even if you wanted to bring me back, the bureaucracy wouldn't allow it." Washington smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office. "That's where you're wrong. The Air Force has been quietly developing new programs for utilizing retired aircrew in specialized roles, consulting positions, training assignments, and emergency response coordination. Positions that could make use of your experience without requiring you to meet the same medical standards as active-duty pilots." The offer was tempting, but Ghost had learned to be suspicious of opportunities that seemed too good to be true. "What's the catch?" "The catch is that it would require you to relocate here to Fairchild, work within a military structure that doesn't always appreciate unconventional thinking, and accept that you'll never again be a traditional line pilot. You'd be training others, developing procedures, and serving as a subject matter expert rather than flying operational missions. Ghost stood and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where her military career had begun and effectively ended. The offer represented a chance to remain connected to military aviation without actually flying, to contribute her experience to training the next generation of pilots who might face similar crises. But it also represented acceptance of her limitations, acknowledgement that her days as a frontline aviator were definitively over. The tremors in her left hand had worsened during the stress of the emergency flight, and she could feel the familiar ache building in her joints that signaled an incoming flare-up of chronic pain. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course, but Ghost." Washington's use of her call sign carried weight of shared history and mutual respect. "What you did today reminded me why I recommended you for combat operations in the first place. You have something that can't be taught in flight school, the ability to see solutions when everyone else sees only problems." As Ghost prepared to leave Fairchild and return to civilian life, she carried with her the knowledge that today had changed something fundamental about how the military viewed damaged veterans. Her actions aboard Flight 447 would be studied, analyzed, and ultimately incorporated into training programs designed to maximize the contributions of aircrew who no longer met standard medical requirements. But more than that, today had changed her understanding of her own worth. For 3 years, she'd believed the medical board's assessment that her injuries made her unsuitable for aviation operations. Today had proven that sometimes the most valuable pilots were those who had been broken by combat and rebuilt themselves through sheer determination. The call sign Ghost had taken on new meaning. She wasn't a ghost because she could disappear. She was a ghost because everyone assumed she was finished, only to discover she was still very much present when circumstances demanded her particular combination of skills and experience. As her flight back to civilian life prepared for takeoff, Ghost made her decision. She would return to Fairchild, accept Washington's offer, and find ways to contribute to military aviation that didn't require her to pretend her injuries didn't exist. The Air Force had taught her to fly, but combat had taught her to survive. Today had taught her that sometimes survival meant accepting help, admitting limitations, and finding new ways to serve beyond the cockpit. 3 months later, Major Callista Ghost Reeves reported for duty at the Air Force's new Crisis Management and Emergency Response Training Center at Fairchild Air Force Base. Her first assignment was developing curriculum for a program called Human Factors in Equipment Failure Scenarios. Training, designed to prepare pilots for situations where technology failed and experience became the only reliable navigation system. Her office was small, spartanly furnished, and overlooked the same flight line where she'd learned to fly decades earlier. On her desk sat 2 items: the Purple Heart she'd earned after her final combat mission, and a child's drawing of an airplane with the words, "Thank you for bringing us home," written in purple crayon. The drawing reminded her daily that aviation wasn't about the aircraft, the technology, or even the pilots. It was about the fundamental human desire to travel safely from one place to another, to be reunited with loved ones, to arrive home despite the dangers that lurked between departure and destination. Ghost's first class consisted of 12 experienced pilots from various aircraft types, all of whom had heard stories about the Ghost flight, but none of whom initially took seriously the prospect of being trained by a medically retired officer with visible tremors in her left hand. That skepticism lasted exactly until she began describing the decision-making process aboard Flight 447, the split-second calculations that had guided them through a storm system that meteorologists later classified as one of the most severe on record. As she spoke, the assembled pilots began to understand that they were receiving instruction from someone who had faced down death in both combat and civilian aviation, and had found ways to prevail in both environments. The most important lesson from Flight 447, she concluded her first lecture, isn't about navigation techniques or weather interpretation. It's about the moment when all your training, all your experience, and all your assumptions about how aviation is supposed to work get stripped away, and you have to make decisions based purely on judgment and instinct. A captain from the 92nd Air Refueling Wing raised his hand. "Major, what do you do when your instinct tells you to do something that contradicts established procedures?" Ghost smiled, remembering her decision to descend into the storm rather than climb above it, her choice to trust a Coast Guard radar contact over aviation weather services, her willingness to attempt an approach in conditions that exceeded published minimums. "Captain, procedures are designed to handle normal situations. When everything goes wrong simultaneously, procedures become guidelines rather than absolute rules. Your job as a pilot is to understand the principles behind the procedures well enough to know when following them blindly will kill you." The lesson resonated through the classroom like the shock wave from a sonic boom. These were experienced military pilots, many with combat experience, but most had never been forced to confront the limitations of their training in quite this way. Over the following months, Ghost's program became one of the most requested advanced training courses in Air Mobility Command. Pilots who completed her curriculum reported feeling more confident in their ability to handle complex emergencies, but more importantly, they developed a deeper understanding of the human factors that determined success or failure when technology couldn't be trusted. The program's success led to invitations to brief senior Air Force leadership on crisis management principles, consultation requests from commercial aviation safety organizations, and ultimately, a request to testify before Congress about the military's approach to utilizing retired aircrew with specialized experience. But the moment that mattered most to Ghost came 6 months after she'd begun teaching, when a C-17 crew credited her training with saving their aircraft after multiple system failures over the mountains of Afghanistan. The pilot, Major Rebecca Santos, had used navigation techniques learned in Ghost's course to guide her aircraft to safety when GPS and inertial navigation systems failed simultaneously. "We called it pulling a ghost," Santos reported during her debrief, "flying by instinct and experience when everything else failed." The phrase caught on throughout Air Mobility Command, then spread to other major commands as word of Ghost's teaching methods reached pilots across the Air Force. Pulling a ghost became military aviation slang for successfully navigating crisis situations through skill and determination rather than technology and standard procedures. Ghost heard about the phrase's popularity through the informal networks that connected military aviation communities worldwide, but she didn't fully understand its impact until Colonel Washington called her into his office for their quarterly performance review. "Do you know what you've accomplished here?" he asked, gesturing toward a stack of commendation letters from pilots who had completed her training program. Ghost shrugged. "I've been teaching pilots to think for themselves when their equipment fails." "You've been teaching them that experience matters more than equipment, that human judgment can triumph over technological failure, and that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from people who have been broken and rebuilt themselves." Washington pulled out a folder marked "Classified" and set it on his desk between them. "The Air Force Personnel Command has been tracking the performance of aircrew who have completed your training program. Across every metric we can measure mission success rates, emergency response times, crew survival in adverse conditions. Pilots trained in your methods outperform their peers by significant margins." He opened the folder to reveal statistics that painted a picture of measurable improvement in aviation safety and mission effectiveness. But more than numbers, the folder contained testimonials from pilots who credited Ghost's training with saving their lives, their crews, and their missions. The Chief of Staff,